Welcome everyone. My name is Nick Clyde from Lock the Gate Alliance from Sydney. Welcome. My co-hosts are Deirdre Stewart, Craig and Dr. Rada Germanos from Protect Our Water Alliance. This is a joint effort from Lock the Gate and POWA tonight. So thank you very much for coming. Before we go any further, I just did want to acknowledge that where's my little slide control there? Sorry. Just did want to acknowledge that most of you are joining us from Dharawal country, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And we are certainly going to be hearing more about the impacts of the Dendrobium project on Aboriginal cultural heritage in a little while. In terms of the agenda tonight and what that looks like, we are recording right now, as I mentioned earlier. We've got about an hour and a bit of content. I'm just going to explain how the webinar is going to work, a bit of an overview of the public hearing process, a snapshot of the project itself. We're going to cover greenhouse, bushfire risk, ecosystem damage, Indigenous cultural heritage, a very short snapshot of the economics and the strategic context of this project, and then with some time for Q&A at the end. In terms of, if you'd like to ask a question at any point, please do type it straight into the Q&A box. I hope most of you are familiar with that. You can also ask a question in the chat box. It's a little easier to manage if you type that straight into the Q&A box. And then any one of us hosts will attempt to answer that as we go, or we may cover that at the end of the webinar. Okay, so that's the agenda. Moving on then to the process of, I think probably most of you or many of you have participated in Independent Planning Commission assessments in the past. Some people may not have. I just wanted to cover the essentials for you. The Minister for Planning has referred this project to the IPC, so they will now have legal authority to make the final decision. Minister Stokes has asked the IPC to consider the final assessment report from the Department of Planning, draft conditions of consent, any issues that any of you people participating tonight raise, either in your written submissions or at the public hearing, and any other material that the IPC panel itself thinks is relevant. So in terms of where to find key documents, there's two places where you can look, well, more than two places. Two main places are the Department of Planning's planningportal.nsw webpage. So if you visit that page and just type in Dendrobium, there's a recommendation folder there that has some interesting documents in it. And also on the IPC's Dendrobium page itself, you will find some of the key documents, and they also post some additional documents which you might like to look at further down the track, such as a written transcript of everything that is said during the public hearings. In terms of the really important things to know about this process, one is that we absolutely are encouraging everyone who's up for it to register to speak at the public hearing. And if you want to speak directly to the IPC panel, it is an online hearing. So if you'd like to speak directly to the panel and share your views with them, you need to register by 5 p.m. this coming Monday via the IPC's webpage. If you register, then almost certainly you will be able to speak at the hearing, which will be held over 3 days, Wednesday 2 to Friday 4 December, from about 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning till about 5 in the afternoon. And the other important thing is that if you want to get a written submission in, you need to do so by 5 p.m. on the 15th of December. So please pop that date in your diary if you're planning on making a written submission. In terms of registering to speak, it really is quite simple. Just visit the IPC's page and fill out your details in their on their form there. If you have any problems at all, please call the IPC staff directly and they will help you, and the number's on their website. Once the public hearing will be held, they're all online at the moment. most of you, I think, have probably seen it. If you haven't, that's a screenshot of the last one that they held into the Maxwell underground mine. You'll be on screen. It works a lot like this Zoom webinar or a Zoom meeting. It's fairly straightforward. If you do need, if you need it, sorry, if you haven't used this system and you're unsure about it, after you've registered to speak, the Planning Commission does invite you to participate in a practice session with them, where you can kind of troubleshoot your internet connection and how the video is working, etc. A lot of people just speak straight down the barrel of the camera on their laptops, and either with a written presentation or just something off the cuff. You can do that. You can also share slides and video as per any regular kind of Zoom function. And we've already covered written submissions due 15 December. Okay, so that's it for my introduction about IPC process. I hope that was the minimum viable product for you guys to participate in the Dendrobium assessment. I would now like to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Rada Germanos from Protect Our Water Alliance. Over to you, Rada.
Hi everyone. I'll just set up my screen. Okay, hopefully that's working. Okay, Deidre's giving me the thumbs up. That's great. Yeah, I'm from Protect Our Water Alliance. You can see the t-shirt. I'm going to be speaking about a few things to start off with. First of all, a bit of an overview of what the Greater Sydney water catchment is. Why do we care? Overview of longwall mining and subsidence, and then moving on to water impacts. So to start. So the Greater Sydney Water Catchment covers a really large area. Here's a map that you can see from the Water New South Wales website. So basically, if you live in Wollongong or the Illawarra, your water is probably coming from the Upper Nepean catchment, which is the yellow section in the middle. And the shaded areas that you can see there are the special areas of the Greater Sydney Water Catchment. So they are the bits that you're not allowed to walk into, and they are of high value, both in terms of the catchment infrastructure, as well as the ecosystems and ecology that's there. And here is another picture that basically just demonstrates where the special areas are. So the special areas are in red. So they are the parts that if you were to walk in there, you're liable to a $44,000 fine. As you can see, basically the water catchment that is west of Wollongong, up on the escarpment, is essentially all special areas. If you're driving from Wollongong to Sydney, up Mount Ousley, if you look towards the left as you're driving along northwards, you'll see, if you pay attention, lots of little signs everywhere that say special areas, no entry, entry prohibited. Same if you're driving along Appin Road, the Old Princess Highway, keep an eye out, you'll see these signs everywhere, and that's the special areas of the water catchment. Just a bit of overview about some kind of agencies, government agencies that we're going to be talking about. So we'll talk about Water New South Wales, Sydney Water. I used to think these were the same things, they're actually not. So Water New South Wales basically operates the the water supply systems, and they're in charge of maintaining infrastructure, i.e. dams. Whereas Sydney Water supplies, is a state-owned corporation that essentially supplies water to individuals in Greater Sydney and the Illawarra. There are Water New South Wales or the Greater Sydney Water Catchment has about 11 dams, and the Dendrobium mine that we're talking about tonight lies between the Avon and Cordo dams. So if I just go back a couple of slides, there's a few little blue triangles on the map. If you look at the blue triangles in the yellow shaded section, you'll see one that says Avon and one that says Cordo. So that's the area that we're talking about tonight. This is another map that just demonstrates, or that just kind of shows the extent of coal exploration licenses, so like mining licenses and applications, as well as existing mining leases. So the mining leases, i.e. where coal companies or mining companies have a lease from the government that says that they can mine, they are the ones that are in red. And the exploration leases, so where companies can go and drill and go exploring for new, coal deposits, are in blue. So if you kind of recall the previous maps, basically virtually all of the special areas that are west of Wollongong are also subject to exploration or mining leases, or both. And this kind of area is referred to as the southern coalfields. And most of the coal in this area is coal that's used to make steel or metallurgical coal. There is also some coal that's used for energy production or thermal coal. But this kind of area around Wollongong, the majority of the coal is for steel making. Some of this coal is used at the Port Kembla Steelworks. Most of this coal is exported overseas, and I think Nick will talk about this in a bit more detail later. So why are we worried about coal mining in the water catchment? So there's basically been, numerous studies, and on the next few slides you'll see, a snapshot of how many studies there have been over the last couple of decades about coal mining related damage in the water catchment. Most of the time it's found that more damage occurs than what is predicted in the approvals process and the planning assessment processes for these mines. We lose water from both surface water and groundwater, and we'll kind of talk about this a little bit more later. Water is polluted from mining, often increases in salinity, decreases in dissolved oxygen, and pollution with like heavy metals. Ecosystems that hold water, filter water, such as upland swamps, and I think this will be talked about in a bit more detail later, are damaged permanently, and they lose their function and their ability to hold water and filter water as they should when they are healthy. And essentially that, the government knows about all of this damage. It's quite hidden away from the public eye because you're not allowed to walk into the water catchment, or you're liable to a $44,000 fine. So it can just kind of happen. And some of the photos that I think all of us will probably have in our presentations that you'll see tonight from, the few allowed visits into the water catchment to document damage. So a lot of these photos are actually quite old because people aren't allowed to go in there and survey the damage and do citizen science and see what's actually going on in there. So as such, the extent of damages and the kind of like ephemeral nature of water, how you measure water, where does the water go, means that it's really difficult to ascertain the full extent of damage and as well as water losses. And we probably will never know these things. So here are a snapshot of some of the expert reports. As you can see, there are many. I'm not going to talk about them all, but they're there if you'd like to read them. In terms of coal mining methods, so some of you, especially if you've grown up like around the Illawarra, you'll know that there's been mining in the Illawarra since, like the 1850s, basically. Essentially as soon as the area was like colonized, there's been mining. Historically, this was like board and pillar mining, which is basically they leave kind of, as they mine along underground, they leave these kind of pillars in place to hold the roof up. Over time, these pillars kind of, fill with water, they get a bit soggy and they can collapse, and so the roof can collapse. And there's certainly been quite a lot of damage within the water catchment, the escarpment areas from board and pillar mining. Since about the 1960s, longwall mining has been introduced. So that's basically highly mechanized. They basically carve out these essentially highways deep underground. So it's often, a few hundred meters underground. They'll carve out these essentially, roads or highways that are about, 2 to 3 meters tall, like 300 meters wide, and often several kilometers long. And as the kind of longwall machines go along, they'll mine an area, move along, and the area that they've left behind, the roof collapses down. So you can imagine if this is, 300 meters underground, the roof of the long wall will collapse, up to 3 meters, and that will transmit all the way up to the surface. So you can get what's called subsidence, which can be, like 2 to 3 meters at the surface. Obviously, this cracks all the rock on the way up. So you get, cracks and fissures at the surface. You get, underground streams and things that weren't communicating with each other before and now communicating with each other. And water can pour into the mine, and then the mines have to pump the water out. Some of you might be aware of, there's like a discharge point from the Dendrobium mine down in Unanderra at Allens Creek. So that's like an example of the mines having to pump water out of their mines, because otherwise the mines will fill with water from all the water that's coming in as they crack all the rock layers. The New South Wales Chief Scientist in 2014 found that the Sydney Water Catchment is actually the only publicly owned catchment in the world that allows longwall mining underneath it, which is kind of shocking, really. This is the only place in the world that this is allowed to happen. So here's basically a fancy diagram of what I was just trying to describe about how the roof collapses behind a longwall machine as a longwall machine moves along mining. And this is what you can see at the surface. So the picture at the top left is due to the damage from the Metropolitan mine up near Helensburgh, and same on the bottom right. So that's not the mine we're talking about tonight, but that's another mine in the area that does longwall mining. The image at bottom left is damage from the Dendrobium mine. So you can see that giant crack in the rock. That's like 400 millimeters wide, so 40 centimeters wide. And you can imagine that, that whole area probably has cracks that big or, similar size through it because of this longwall mining. And this is the kind of damage that we will see in new areas if the Dendrobium expansion goes ahead. So, which is a good segue onto discussing the extension proposal. So the Dendrobium mine is a mine that's owned by South32, which is like a multinational company that's a spin-off from BHP. It's been an operational mine since 2002. And if you drive through the village of Mount Kembla and you keep going up, you'll see it on the right-hand side just before you get to Windy Gully and the nice Mount Kembla ring track. And South32 also owns the Appin mine, which is up near Appin, and also another mostly metallurgical coal mine. So the Dendrobium mine already has a development consent that extends to 2030. They think that they'll probably deplete their mineable reserves, i.e. the coal that they're already kind of have approval for, by 2024. Most of the coal that they dig up is exported. Some of that coal goes to Port Kembla Steelworks. So they're currently mining in an area called Area 3, and they are seeking approval to extend into 2 new areas called Area 5 and Area 6. This is a bit complicated and wordy, but basically they want to try and mine up to 5 million tonnes of raw coal or run-of-mine coal each year. And then when that's processed, it'll be about 10% thermal coal, about 70% coking coal. And that can be, and the coking coal is used in steel production. So there will be thermal coal that will be mined should this extension go ahead. So here is a picture of the proposed Area 5 and Area 6. So if you look at this map, the boxes that are outlined in purple, they are the current, that's the kind of current boundaries of the mine, if you like. So they're currently mining in Area 3, which is slightly westwards. Going further west, you see some orange boxes. So there's Area 6 and Area at the top, and Area 5. As you can see, Area 6 is really close to Cordo Dam, and Area 5 is really close to Avon Dam. And also, if you're somebody that drives along like Picton Road going west, it might be interesting to know how far along that road, Area 6 extends. So this mine extends for like tens of kilometres west. So This is a slightly more detailed picture of the proposed longwalls in Area 5 and Area 6. So you can see how close they get to Cordo Dam and Avon Dam. Some of these longwalls come within about 300 metres of the reservoirs. And, you know, in contrast, any other significant infrastructure project has to be set back 1,000 metres from, you know, major infrastructure such as a reservoir. It's expected, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, that there will be, you know, cracking of the reservoirs because of mining that comes, you know, this close. And we're also expecting that there will be subsidence, that kind of surface cracking, of probably, you know, 2 to 2.5 metres because of these long walls. They did, you know, South 32, they recognise it's going to be damaging. They did say that they would shorten the length of one of their long walls by about 300 metres. But you can see, so this is their kind of revised application. You can see it still comes pretty close to Avon and Cordo dams. So in summary, South 32 is basically trying to keep mining until 2048 or another 28 years. They want to dig out a total of 77 million tonnes of raw coal. It's underneath the metropolitan special areas of the water catchment. It's longwall mining, which as we can see is super destructive, and we have photo evidence of how destructive this is from existing mining operations. And it comes to, you know, within 300 metres of our dams that, you know, certainly the Illawarra relies on for its water supply. And some of the water from these dams also goes to the Sydney region, where 5 million people live. This is, sorry, I'm just going to have a drink of water because I've got a little tickle in my throat. Okay, so this is some modelling that South 32 have in their environmental impact statement. It's basically just going a bit deeper into the subsidence. I guess you can read that. Basically kind of things like rocky features like cliffs and boulders and rocky outcrops are more susceptible to subsidence related impacts, I guess because of, you know, like shearing forces and things, as well as like, you know, creek beds, sandstone bases of upland swamps, that kind of thing. This is quite interesting. So this is the Department of Planning's response or submission to the IPC. They've basically said that there will be lots of damage because of longwall mining. That basically longwall mining, even if you were to reduce the width of the longwalls in half, so even if they were 150 metres wide instead of 300 metres wide, they would still be really damaging, and it wouldn't prevent subsidence, and it would still destroy upland swamps. And so the department then concludes that basically there's no point even trying to reduce the longwall width, because if you're going to make them small enough that it wouldn't cause damage, it would be uneconomic. So essentially the department is saying that, you know, this mine can't go ahead in a non-damaging form, because for it to go ahead in a non-damaging form, it wouldn't be profitable, which I guess raises some questions about who is the department looking after. So to talk about water impacts. So as we've kind of discussed, you know, Area 5, Area 6, they're both very close to Avon and Cordo reservoirs.
Sorry, Rada, just to interrupt, you've got 2 minutes left, okay?
Oh, gosh, okay. No worries, thanks. Okay, I might skip through this a little bit quickly. Okay, so basically the estimated water loss from the entire Sydney water catchment because of mining related impacts is probably more than 34 million litres of water a day, which is basically the equivalent usage of half of Wollongong. Water New South Wales is opposed to this expansion. They are, so remember they're the body that looks after the dams and the infrastructure. They basically say they are worried that the dam walls will crack and lots of water will be lost, which will basically have a net negative benefit on the water catchment. And they've been quite strongly had quite strong language in their objections to this expansion proposal. There's an independent advisory panel on underground mining that's also was kind of commissioned by the IPC, the Independent Planning Commission, to provide some independent advice. And they've said that essentially they don't know that the Dendrobium mine can be sealed, i.e. rehabilitated once it finishes in 2048, should they get this expansion proposal, and that we can just assume that there will be loss of water into perpetuity. So basically, once the mine is finished and done, it can't be rehabilitated. We don't know if it can be rehabilitated, and we're probably going to lose water forever. It's also interesting, I haven't put it in these slides, but South32 only model their water losses up until like 2050. So you don't really know after the mine is finished how much water is going to be lost from the environment. I might just skip through that. Here's just a picture from a different mine of contaminated water, contaminated surface water due to mining. So basically you release water comes into contact with, you know, heavy metals and things that it previously wasn't in contact with. And then you get this, you know, pollution of surface creeks, which is, you know, within our water catchment area as well, which kind of compromises the safety of our water supply. Not to mention is highly damaging for the environment, the ecosystems, all of the other non-human life that relies on these areas to exist. And that's it. I think I've probably snuck in just, Deidre's giving me the thumbs up. Thank you, Deidre. There's so much information in this. It'll all be available after this webinar if you'd like to know more.
Fantastic. Well, look, thank you so much, Dr. Germanos. Tony had asked for an extension of time for you, rather. So I think people were enjoying your presentation. If you were Radha's with us for the rest of the webinar, so please do feel free to type a question, Tony, or anyone else into the Q&A box, and Radha will be with us as part of the panel to come back to your questions later on. Thanks, Radha. So our next speaker is Deirdre Stewart, who's going to speak about greenhouse emissions.
Thanks, Nick. Okay, talking about greenhouse emissions, obviously this is a coal mine, so it's going to produce lots of greenhouse emissions. If any of you want to write an objection related to greenhouse gas emissions, you just have to be aware of the way greenhouse gas emissions are talked about in accountancy perspective. So they talk about scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see that scope 1s are the ones that the company or the entity emits directly, whereas scope 2 emissions are ones from materials they purchase, for example, associated with electricity that's been purchased. And finally, scope 3 are emissions that are indirect, other than, say, associated with things like purchasing electricity. So in this case, the scope 3 emissions are when the product coal leaves the port, the transport, and then its combustion in the wherever it's consumed. So whether at Port Kembla or Whyalla or overseas. And I want you to also look at this third column in this table. You'll see that that's the total emissions over the 28-year project life. And the column to the right-hand side are the average annual greenhouse gas emissions. And I want you to see that the sum, the scope 1 and the scope 2, if you add them together, they're about 1/10 of what the scope 3 is. So one of the things to be aware, if you look at the documents associated with this, is that usually organisations will, whether countries or companies, will only really consider their scope 1 and scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions. and exclude the scope 3 emissions. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about that in those two sets. The other thing to be aware of is that these estimated emissions, the scope 1 or scope 2 and scope 3 emissions, completely exclude any emissions that are associated with the destruction of the swamps on top of the water catchment. So I'm just going to try and move that. So I think it's important that to put these emissions in context, and that's something that the New South Wales Planning Department, I think, fails to do, and also South 32 fails to do. So this slide, which we'll make available to you all later, basically I've dug out what the emissions were in 2005 and whatever I could get most recently for New South Wales or Australia, either 2016 or 2018. And that's because I wanted to work out what our target emissions are in 2030 according to the Paris Agreement for the Australian government, or the New South Wales government, which is a 35% reduction on 2005 levels by 2030. So all this slide shows are what those values would be. So I've worked them out here, and I'll be providing these slides to you all later. But I go on from there to also work out, well, in order to get from, say, here in New South Wales, to get from a 2016 value of 131.6 megatons CO2 equivalents per year. At 2030, if I had a straight line decline of greenhouse gas emissions, this number here, 1.89, represents the amount of greenhouse gas emissions I'd have to reduce each year. So what I wanted to do is put the emissions that are, now I'm just looking at scope 1, scope 2 emissions. I'm playing the game that that the IPC commissioners play, I think, and that is to ignore scope 3. But for the moment, just considering scope 1 and scope 2, they think that they are insignificant. But I want you to see that the fraction that they are of current emissions is, about 0.5% currently. But that percentage, that fraction increases. Sorry, let's look at the total combined. That fraction increases up to, not that far off 1% by 2030. When you consider them, looking at this fifth column here, when you consider these emissions in terms of how much they are as a fraction of the reduction that New South Wales has to do each year, you're heading up to about 50% of the reduction that needs to be done. Similarly, if you do a similar analysis in terms of the Australian annual emissions in 2018 versus what they'd be in 2030 if we meet our target, and also the reduction required year on year, I provide the data there. So I actually think that, if we look at this one here for New South Wales, for instance, at almost 1% or about 1/100th of New South Wales emissions, I actually think that's quite significant. That's what it would be in 2030 if it's allowed to go ahead. You have to remember that this is a single corporation's single mining operation, and South 32 actually has several mining operations. But what about the scope 3 emissions? Remember, these are about 10 times as much as the scope 1 and 2 emissions combined. Really, the climate doesn't care whether it's, about accounting. All greenhouse gas emissions contribute to the climate disruption that we're experiencing. So looking at a different perspective, the IPCC 2018 special report said that if we want to limit global warming to less than or equal to 1.5 degrees C, then globally by 2030, primary energy needs from coal needs to be reduced by 59%. So in that context, this coal mining extension proposal spanning 28 years makes absolutely no sense. Similarly, the Australia Institute in 2019 released a report. It talked about basically we're a very big emitter as a country. But the third dot point down the bottom here is that we come third after Russia and Saudi Arabia. This is based on 2016 data. We come third in terms of our exported fossil fuel CO2 equivalent potential. And coal makes up a lot of this export. So,
sorry to interrupt, you're at about the 8-minute mark.
Okay, so we have a responsibility globally to do this. So the thing I find annoying, very annoying in the reports is that South 32 and the Department of Planning want it both ways. They want to say that Dendrobium is needed for BlueScope and Liberty steel making, yet they still don't want the Scope 3 emissions, which will be Australian emissions if they're combusted within Australia at BlueScope or Liberty, to be considered. Also, you know, if we disclaim Scope 3 emissions, then that assumes that the whole world is going to fail to deal with climate change, whereas the trends suggest otherwise. South Korea, Japan, China, our major coal importers, have recently declared ambitious climate targets. They are co-signatories of the Paris Agreement. They're also the largest steel producers in the world. So they're going to be diminishing their coke and coal imports, presumably over time. There's also action on green steel, and you know, we need to do our bit. I think a truer perspective on the total emissions associated with this project come from putting the total is equal to 9 megatons of CO2 equivalent per year. When I looked up a list of countries for how much that is in terms of what countries produce, well, I found that in 2015, which was the latest complete set of data that the European Commission EDGAR data had, 67 countries out of the 211 listed countries had total greenhouse gas emissions less than what would be produced or associated with this single mining operation. So I think that is the real perspective. I'm sick of seeing news like this where we say, well, we don't give a damn about our Pacific Islands. I received an email recently about the famine and climate change in Guatemala and the millions of people who now have no food. I read about climate refugees. I hear about, Australian Indigenous people in Alice Springs saying they can't live there anymore. I've got some garbage in the slides about bits from the Department of Planning that you can read, but I find it quite shocking. And that's all I'm going to say because I know I've got to wrap up.
Hey, thank you for that, Deirdre. That's a great summary of the greenhouse issues. And if you've got any further questions on that, please type them into the Q&A box for Deirdre and the other panelists to answer. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. So our next speaker is Craig Perrett, who's going to talk about bushfire risk. Over to you, Craig.
Thanks, Nick. That's showing up okay?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
So hi, everyone. Tonight I'm going to talk about another perspective on the mining extension proposal, which is the effect of dehydration from the water drainage that Rada has spoken of tonight. So Rada has eloquently, in both words and pictures, shown you the cracking on the surface. The mine acknowledges that there will be all sorts of cracking connecting surface and groundwater. And what this what this leads to is significant dehydration of the land. I'm going to talk tonight about the implications for bushfire from a New South Wales perspective, but obviously we all remember from last summer the national crisis that came out of the Black Summer bushfires. One of the things that the proposal does, certainly this version of the proposal, is a lot more honest and upfront about the level of damage that is going to be provided. And that's kind of an interesting thing in its own right, because earlier iterations were less sophisticated and tended to treat water loss as a monolithic thing. The current version of the proposal is pretty upfront about the effects of the damage. But in terms of the treatment of that damage, it tends to be dealt with, again, at a monolithic level about water loss. And certainly the topic of tonight is focusing on drinking water, but drinking is not the only thing that happens with the water that we're concerned with. We are not the only consumers of that. Being animals and flora are the other major consumers. So surface water loss dries up the surface geology, which includes upland swamps, bushland, and forests. And what we know is that the moisture level in swamps and forests is a major influence on the spread of bushfires. And last year's fires, not only did the temperatures within Australia get up to 49.7 degrees ambient temperature, but the temperature of the fires themselves was significantly higher than what we'd seen. And we saw significantly more destruction, rather than the surfaces of tree bark being consumed, we had, the entire trees being consumed in many areas because of the intensity of the fire. And that is in part a function not only of the fuel load that's available to the fire, but also the level of moisture. And so the moisture, particularly in the surface parts of swamps and forests, has a major influence on the intensity of the fire and the risk of fire. One of the other things we know about upland swamps is that when they retain their hydration, they recover their functions rapidly after bushfire. And there are three major functions for swamps. One is their role in water purification, plant hydration, so forest, bushlands, peat, moss, and biodiversity, the creatures that these swamps support. What we see on the other hand is that drained swamps, dehydrated swamps, do not recover. And moreover, their flora is often replaced by weeds, noxious weeds, and more fire-prone plants, making it worse in subsequent fire season. I'm going to show you a couple of photos of before and after mining at the East Walgan Swamp. So what you see at the top is pre-mining, and you can see the grasslands there as well as the edges of the forest. And on the right-hand side, you can see more of the forest. And when you look at what happens after mining, you can see that the entire structure of the surface has changed. And yeah, they just do not recover after fire. So let's talk about fires. Last Black Summer 2019-2020 was one of the most destructive bushfires on record. And I've summarized some of the tolls there. 18 million hectares, which was 6.2% of the state of New South Wales. Massive toxic runoff into the waterways, into the oceans and rivers. 3 billion plus fauna killed. About 3,000 houses, but overall about 8,000, another 5,500 outbuildings. And the effect on human health was massive. 86% of Australians said that they were affected by those fires. We had 33 deaths, 6 of whom were firefighters, and people may remember the airborne firefighters from the US who crashed and died.
Sorry, Craig, just letting you know you've got 2 minutes left.
Thanks. We've also seen a massive impact on mental health, not least of which is the firefighters. We've seen a great uptake of mental health services by emergency services persons who, this was really unprecedented, the shock of this fire. We had 143 million mammals, 180 million birds, 51 million frogs, and so on. Massive, and some extinction of endangered species. The emergency chiefs made a statement in the notes of the slides. You'll see the link, that we're going to see hotter, longer fire periods. And while they used to be staggered across the world, allowing sharing of assets with other countries, that is no longer the case, which means that we are largely on our own, as is Canada, the US, and the other countries. $500 million was raised by Australians, showing how mobilised we were as a country towards trying to deal with this better. Everybody but the mining companies are mobilising. In fact, South 32's strategy is to make the special areas that Deirdre and Rada have talked about, is to make them drier, which will increase the bushfire risk. And you have to ask yourself, it does seem a little bit counterintuitive that when we have a tinderbox, that our strategy is to make it drier. As both Rada and Deirdre have highlighted, the New South Wales government is supporting this proposal against the advice of their own water managers and their most experienced emergency chiefs. Again, it seems a little counterintuitive. The question that I really ask myself in considering all this is that one of the crazy things is that many of the fires that we experienced last year, or early this year and last year, were lit by arsonists. But considering the action of our own government and of the coal companies, it really asks me, well, what is arson? And just to wrap up, this is from the 1968 Illawarra fires. We have been very fortunate in the Illawarra not to have had serious fires in the escarpment since then. But we now face this question of, do we continue to dehydrate the special areas and bring them on again? Or do we preserve our surface moisture as well as our drinking water and reduce the risk? And I'll leave that with you.
Thank you so much, Craig. And as a reminder, if you've got further questions about bushfire or other issues, please type them in the Q&A box. And Craig will also be with us for the panel discussion at the end. Okay, our next speaker is Deirdre Stewart again, this time on the impacts of this project on ecosystems in this very sensitive area.
Thanks, Nick. I'm not an expert on ecosystems, but this is more or less what I'm learning from reading through these documents and about the ecosystems, and also what the various government agencies have had to say. So we've heard about the landscape damage from Rada, how the mining cracks the catchment above. Well, this causes changes to the water table, and this translates into damage and destruction of ecosystems in the Sydney Water Catchment. The ecosystems provide habitats for species, and it's already accepted within the documents that there's going to be a loss of ecosystems or ecological communities and species. It is truly a special area, these preserved areas in the Sydney Water Catchment, and they are special ecologically because they have been set aside for a long period over the colonisation. Within the special catchment, there are what's called coastal upland swamps. They are considered endangered ecological communities, both in the Australian Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act and also in the New South Wales Threatened Species Conservation Act. That's actually been overridden in time, but this is the act that's relevant in the assessment of this particular proposal. Last year, the United Nations declared an extinction crisis and talked about how there's 1 million animal and plant species threatened with extinction. And they have a little video on their website at the link at the bottom, and you can find out that the global drivers for changes in nature, well, not surprisingly perhaps, this particular project contributes to 3 of the top 5 direct drivers of changes in nature resulting in loss of species. And that includes climate change, pollution, and changes to land and sea or sea use. You've heard about how the hydrogeological changes caused by the damage to the catchment cause loss of water. So this is a picture that was taken in the water catchment in a special area, and it shows an indicator upland swamp species, Banksia robur. It dies, and then this other species, the plants and flora, the flora and fauna around it can also die, the ones that rely on it. Another thing to realize is that coastal upland swamps, as well as providing protection against bushfire and water services and all these amazing ecological services, they provide carbon capture and storage services as well. The project EIS and the department's assessment report, neither of them consider or estimate greenhouse gas emissions associated with the expected swamp destructions. And that's, remember, 26 upland swamps directly, completely contained over the longwalls. And they don't consider the loss of carbon uptake that the swamps currently performed. So this is going to be extra emissions that we weren't expecting to have and have to deal with. This article, if you look it up, it provides some dollar values associated with these functions that these swamps currently perform. Through the process through the whole assessment process, the New South Wales Office of Environment and Heritage, which then became the Biodiversity and Conservation Division, these agencies expressed strong concerns about the project. So we've heard already that Water New South Wales is expressing very strong concerns. These agencies are also expressing very concerns about the project. So, for instance, they said that the proposed mine layout likely has significant impacts on threatened species and ecological communities. That's not contested in the department's assessment report. But, you know, these agencies say it does not satisfactorily demonstrate the avoid principle. And that avoid principle is contained within the mining SEP, SEPP. You're meant to avoid damage and destruction and things like this. They say, of course, longwall subsidence will cause further long-term adverse impacts. They complain about lack of detail, lack of transparency, lack of any evidence about effectiveness of proposed mitigation strategies. These are the same mitigation strategies that Dendrobium has used in the past and have shown to be completely useless. They strongly object to the applicant's swamps assessment approach, and they say that the proposed offsets do not adhere to the requirements. I mean, it's actually ludicrous to consider to think that you can offset an ecosystem or an ecological community or species. How do you offset something that's going to be lost? They're unique and irreplaceable. And they also comment about koala, and I think that has come about through the discussion that's going on at New South Wales around koalas at the moment. But you know, there's more interest in them, especially I think since the bushfires, and they're critical that the low measurements of koalas that were observed are not surprising, given that the scrutiny that was done at the survey being done at a non-breeding time. So the overall approach to dealing with the damaging results is really to offset ecosystems and species losses. But I think to an ordinary person like me, at least, I think that's impossible and utterly ludicrous. And that's all for me.
Great, thank you, Deirdre. Yeah, it really is a remarkable part of New South Wales, those swamps and that special area. So I've had the privilege of walking up there with Water New South Wales. It is an amazing area and the damage is quite devastating. Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Germanos, Dr. Rada, who's going to talk about the impacts on Aboriginal cultural heritage, which you might have seen in the news recently in the Illawarra Mercury.
Alrighty. Is that working? Hopefully.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks, Rada.
Great. Okay, cool. So I'm just going to talk about Aboriginal cultural heritage impacts from the proposed Dendrobium expansion. I guess just lots of caveats here. I'm not an Aboriginal person. I guess due to a bit of kind of last minute, chaotic organising of this webinar, we weren't able to get a member of the local land council to come speak or a Darawal person to come speak to this. So I just want to, acknowledge that that was a bit of an organisational issue on our part, but just really didn't want this stuff to go kind of unsaid or undiscussed. And that my kind of information that I have from here is information that's, that's kind of available through like the planning documents and the planning process. So in terms of like cultural heritage sites that will be impacted should this expansion go ahead. If you look at the Dendrobium environmental impact statement and their kind of appendix about Aboriginal cultural heritage, which is pretty short, in their method, they basically only surveyed 6% of the area that will be undermined. They say they went for the areas that they think would be like most damaged, but nevertheless, they only surveyed 6%. And this was kind of like a outsourced to like a assessment contractor. So basically in this 6% area, they identified 58 cultural sites and they were mostly rock shelters. Some had art in them, some were axe grinding grooves. Most of these are estimated to be like at least 2,000 years old. And we know from kind of recent news about places like Whale Cave, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, some sites in the like escarpment area are estimated to be up to 4,000 years old, probably older. So, very old, very significant sites. And basically everything is potentially subject to subsidence effects, especially, speaking before about, like rocky areas, sandstone areas being particularly vulnerable to subsidence effects. If we're thinking about, rock shelters, axe grinding grooves, like, these are kind of rocky formations, so they're very vulnerable. South 32, of course, as a mining company will, kind of gave some fairly soft assurance that they will, try to avoid damaging cultural sites as much as is practicable, which, kind of implies that they're not going to avoid damaging sites altogether. They're just going to do it as much as they can whilst still longwalling, still mining, still ripping out coal and exporting it and sending it to BlueScope for profit. And it wasn't really very long ago that Rio Tinto in WA, blew up Juukan Gorge in very similar circumstances. So I think the comfort we can take from this statement is probably the same kind of comfort we could take from Rio Tinto and what happened in WA only just recently. The Department of Planning, in their assessment report to the IPC, basically says that of the 58 sites that were in that 6% surveyed area, they decided that there were 6 that were of significant value. What that means, I think, is inherently offensive. I'm not sure how the Department of Planning assesses cultural value. But anyway, they basically said that there's 6 sites that they think are of like high cultural significance. And one of them will probably, well, 5 of them they're not so worried about because they're located centrally above longwall panels. They don't think that they'll be really impacted by longwall mining. And so we probably don't need to worry about them. But, as you could see from all the pictures that we've shown during this presentation, the predicted subsidence of, 2.8 metres, I think this is probably a pretty weak statement from the Department of Planning. And we know that protections for cultural heritage sites in New South Wales are really weak. So the Australian Heritage Council developed some best practice standards around this, and they reviewed, state and territory legislation. And New South Wales and WA are on par as having the worst legislation in Australia. So basically, mines are required to monitor cultural sites, but there's actually no requirement for them to preserve them. There's no penalty if they destroy them. They basically just have to monitor them and stand idly by whilst they go about their business. So it basically gives them, like the right to destroy sites, provided that they monitor them. There is state legislation though that says that that kind of any kind of planning approval needs to promote the sustainable management of built and cultural heritage, which includes Indigenous cultural heritage. So that is something that should be considered by the IPC as it's part of state legislation. But as we can see, kind of like overall state legislation and protections are quite weak. Oh, sorry, let's go back to that. There's a picture that's just here in the bottom right corner. So those are some folks from the Illawarra Local Aboriginal Land Council who were in the media, I think probably about 6 weeks ago now, speaking about a place called Whale Cave. And this is a place that's, in the escarpment areas, in the kind of water catchment areas, that's estimated to be probably 4,000 years old, and a really special place. And Whale Cave was essentially destroyed by board and pillar mining at Nebo Colliery in the 1980s. And that's, a supposedly less destructive form of mining. And, they estimate that there's probably at least 4,000 cultural sites throughout the escarpment area. And, the Illawarra Local Aboriginal Land Council has written a very strong submission against the Dendrobium expansion project. And I think it's on all of us to carry that opposition as well, and not leave it up to, local folks to, have to make those arguments without the kind of solidarity of non-Aboriginal people, especially non-Aboriginal people that live in the Illawarra, and also, might have connections of their own to this country, but probably not this kind of enduring millennia-long connections that folks would have. So anyway, there's some more information about this kind of stuff on the POWA website in our submission guide. And I'm sure there's a wealth of information that, I'm not privy to around this as well. But I would also, direct people to the Illawarra Local Aboriginal Land Council's objection to the Dendrobium mine, which you can easily Google, and maybe we can send out as well after this webinar. That's me, under time.
Great, thank you, Radha, for that content. And of course, like all the other speakers, if you do have something specific to the impact on Aboriginal cultural heritage, please do pop it in the Q&A box. I'm the last speaker. I'm going to be quite brief, so we're going to come to questions in a moment. I'm just going to share my screen again. with you guys. Okay, here we are. So I thought I'd just say a few quick words on the strategic need for this coal and this project and the economic perspective. The department, if you have a look at the final assessment report, or there's an independent, well, an economic assessment of this project, you'll notice there's some strong language around. There's an argument that Dendrobium really need to be able to develop this longwall project, or it will have all sorts of impacts on the Port Kembla coal export terminal and on BlueScope Steel itself. So that's the sort of setup. But the documents and the department's final assessment report basically begin from the point of, hey, we need a new damaging longwall project in our catchment. And if we don't get that, these are all the bad things that will happen as a result. If you start to unpack the arguments in those documents and start to have a look at it in a little more detail, I think what it boils down to is a few key questions. Really, and the first one is, well, how, we'll always need drinking water, but how long do we need this level of coking coal production? How long do we need to maintain that? Australia's already the biggest exporter of coking coal on the planet by a long margin. And the International Energy Agency are predicting that there will be a decline in demand for coking coal. It's inevitable, and that's driven by the Paris Agreement, climate issues, policy, financial markets favouring more zero carbon alternatives, and technology, the invention of and innovation of new technologies. So that's going to drive a decline. Yeah, and bear in mind that South32 are applying to mine almost to mid-century, to about 2048, 2049. The next issue is, and Radha's talked about this in a little bit of detail, is that Wollongong Coal, who are South32's neighbour, 8 kilometres up the road, and the department itself, with Wollongong Coal's project, they claim that the Borden pillar, which is not great, but it is less damaging on the catchment. And there are all kinds of problems with that Russell Vale proposal, as you guys will know who are on this webinar tonight. But nonetheless, that aside, Wollongong Coal and the department maintain that the Borden pillar mining is economic. 8 kilometres down the road, South32 say it's not. Bear in mind that maintaining that position helps them maintain a very, well, what the department describes as a highly profitable operation with Appin and Dendrobium, making almost $500 million profit in financial year 2019. The third question, really, this is the critical question, is if the green steel transition is inevitable, well, how do we continue to supply BlueScope with enough coking coal that they can continue making steel at Port Kembla until that transition occurs and coal-free steel making is possible? And on that score, if you read the department's final assessment report, you'll see that they reference that BlueScope has a big decision coming up in just a few years' time, 2025, about whether or not to commit to further coal-based steel making and spend $500 million on relining their blast furnace, or whether there's a different decision that might be made, where the technology will have advanced and the economics will advance enough that we can be seriously looking at green steel 2025. Bearing in mind also that Tony Wood, who spoke on our green steel webinar, said that Port Kembla is an ideal place for the federal government and the state government to help catalyse a hydrogen steel pilot project. So I think one of the really big pressure points with this mine proposal and with the IPC's decision is this issue of, well, BlueScope need to be viable. No one wants to see a closure of BlueScope because they can't get enough coal until they do make that transition to green steel. So where can that coal come from? The documents say that they're currently currently using almost 3 million tonnes per annum of coal to make steel at Port Kembla. The first 500,000 tonnes doesn't come from the southern coalfields at all. It's imported from Queensland. And this is in the department and document and the BAE economics assessment. The largest portion of coal, almost 1 million tonnes, comes from Illawarra Coal, South 32's Appin mine, almost 1 million tonnes, and they have approval to continue mining there. That's not in a special area of the catchment until 2041. 800,000 tonnes comes from the Metro mine at the moment. There's a lot of controversy, as you know, about that mine and mining underneath the reservoir. They nonetheless have approval to continue with that mining until 2032. Then there's 100,000 tonnes, which is currently being sourced from the Tamil mine in southwestern Sydney. So what I want you to notice about this is that without any coal at all from Dendrobium, about 82% of BlueScope's needs are currently being met. The documents then go on to say that at the moment, about 500,000 tonnes per annum of BlueScope coal is coming from Dendrobium. Of course, there's much more production in the southern coalfields. As Rada said, that volume is exported at the moment through the Port Kembla coal terminal. So there's lots of production there. There's a strategic question about BlueScope and their coking coal needs. And there's a really critical question through this planning process that we all, as a community, we need to be asking to say, well, look, we need drinking water in perpetuity. BlueScope may only require coking coal through to the end of 2030, another 9 years or so. So the question is, where do you get that coal from, and what's the least damaging method of delivering that coal to BlueScope? Finally,
okay,
ladies
Nick,
and gentlemen,
just giving you a minute.
1 minute. All right. So I think the alternative to that are develop a net zero carbon industry plan. So that's government, BlueScope, the coal miners and the community working together to figure out a plan. And that must be based on no new mining in catchment special areas. We all need to get behind helping BlueScope transition to green steel as soon as possible. We need to be asking the decision maker, the IPC, well, from 2025, is it possible for BlueScope to just buy the 18% of coal they're currently getting from Dendrobium from somewhere else, or from a different project which doesn't damage the special area? And as an absolute minimum, consent should be refused for any further longwall mining at Dendrobium. That's certainly Lock the Gates position. So I'll stop sharing my screen there. That's me done. That was a lot of information. Thank you everyone for sticking with us. We've lost a few people who've had to go and cook dinner and what have you. They've been asking, will we be sharing these presentations in the video? We will. Deirdre will send out an email in a day or two with links to the prezos and further resources. Some of the questions we've answered live already. I might go firstly to you, Deirdre. Stephen Young has asked what your rebuttal to South 32 might be, who argue that offsets can draw down the CO2 emitted.
Before I go there, I noticed that there's a couple of questions about water, and I just wanted to put up this slide about the water. There was, sorry to do this to you, Nick. How much water is going into the mine? That's effectively what's being lost from the catchment, and that's up to 26 megalitres per day. So if anyone wants the number, these various slides will be sending to you, but that's the number in answer to one of the questions. Really importantly, nowhere in the documents do the South 32 or the Department of Planning talk about compensating for groundwater losses. It's all about surface water losses, but groundwater losses are a big part of the picture, and it's just completely neglected. So that's the answer to that question. And going to Stephen's question, sorry, I'll stop sharing my screen. Stephen's question about South 32 offsets draw down the CO2 emitted. Okay, thanks for the question, Stephen. One of the things that was really, really galling to me reading this report was that Department of Planning in their assessment report referred to the New South Wales government and the Commonwealth government getting together and having a coal innovation fund, which some of us may have heard about, and that South 32 could apply, would likely apply to that fund to offset their emissions. There was no, even with the much smaller contingent of greenhouse gas emissions that are produced by electricity, for instance, the scope 2, I didn't see that that South 32 was even proposing to buy them from a renewable source. The way that, you know, any of us here present tonight, we can source our electricity from a renewable source. They were not. They simply do not want to deal with the scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, and the scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions are of a scale where, if they're saying they have no responsibility for them, there's also no way for them to actually ensure that that those emissions are offset in the place where they are emitted. Furthermore, the argument of the department, the planning department's assessment report was that scope 3 emissions, there was some bill to the New South Wales government that scope 3 emissions shouldn't be considered. However, in the mining SEP, it's very clear that they should be. It talks about downstream emissions being relevant. And furthermore, as far as I'm aware, and Nick may correct me, that piece of legislation did not get past the New South Wales government. So they really should be considered and not overlooked.
Yeah, that's right. The territorial limits bill was actually withdrawn. It never went to the upper house. In fact, I don't even think it was voted on in the lower house. So, and the government's now withdrawn it from their notice paper. Excellent. Thank you, Deirdre. That answers your question, Stephen. And maybe if I just can throw in quickly, I think there's also a difference between theoretically can emissions be offset versus will they if this project goes ahead. Our experience is that the government almost never insists on offset. In fact, I can't think of a single example with a coal mining project. Certainly not for scope 3. It's certainly possible for scope 2 and 3 emissions, but it's never done in practice.
Sorry, Nick, can I interrupt there? I actually think if someone wants to I actually put in with Russellville a submission that said, if you are going to approve this, the company, before they start, should offset all scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. That would mean reforestation in Australia in an accredited form. You put that claim in and it becomes uneconomical to do.
Look, it's a legitimate claim and the IPC has the power to impose the conditions to offset should they choose. Yes, so please do that if you want to include it in your submission. I am just scanning through the questions there. Suzanne, you've asked a question. Is there any information on what the economic gain will be for Australians, not just South 32? If you have a look in the department's assessment report, they do talk about their perspective on the economic benefits in that report. There's also a separate cadence economics cost benefit analysis that happened at the time of the EIS. And there's now also an additional review of the economics by BAE Economics, which is available on the Department of Planning's website in the recommendation folder for the Dendrobium mine. So there's quite a lot of information there about that issue. Hope that answers your question. Fellow panelists, can you see anything else that a question you're able to answer for our audience? So would anyone like to have a crack at Fiona's question? Has anyone considered if the community was allowed to access the catchment freely, that the mines would be forced to consider public safety and cause less damage? Should we be campaigning for bushwalking access in the catchment? Does anyone
I love the idea, but yeah, I hadn't considered it.
Ryder or Craig? I'd have a go at that, Fiona. I think having done a tour above Dendrobium and more recently been on a community, on the IPC's tour above Russell Vale, I think what the Water New South Wales position is that the reason they exclude the community is because they are trying to protect the integrity of the catchment to deliver pure drinking water for all of us. So on balance, it's probably a good thing that they keep us out of bushwalking in there. But of course, I think your question cuts to the point of, well, you know, if the special area is that special that it needs that level of protection, should we really be collapsing the land by pulling out, you know, kilometres of coal directly underneath that land? So I hope that answers your question. Sally had a similar question to Suzanne. Are you able to tell us the jobs predictions for the application?
Not off the top of my head.
I'm not quite sure I understand your question, Sally, properly, but if it's overall numbers, I think it's 400 to 500 people employed. Is that right, Craig?
It's somewhere between 300 and 500.
Right.
Yeah.
And Craig, does that roughly maintains existing employment? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I've answered the one about the mines igniting themselves. So there's a question. I've noted there that there is more research needed, but I did a little bit of research, and what I discovered is that there are many mines burning around the world. Some have been burning for years. There's one in Pennsylvania has been burning since 1960s. And in most cases, they seem to have been ignited from the surface, some sort of surface activity, some from underground incidents, but many of them seem to be lightning strikes, which comes to the heart of the question, which is, if there were fires active around coal mines, and particularly if you've got cracking happening between the surface and the mine, does that create an opportunity? So I think number one is the evidence suggests, yes, it's a risk, and it's probably a more serious risk than bushfire because you cannot put them out. And I would also suggest, given the pancake nature of the way these fires are structured next to each other, that, yeah, it could get very hot around the Illawarra.
Great, thank you, Craig. A person has a question about how will the tonnage be carted to port? Is it via truck?
Yes, it's by truck. So Dendrobium has a washery. So the run-of-mine coal goes to the washery, and then it goes down to either the steelworks or to the port, depending on which part of the quota is going where. So Blue Scope gets, which then goes into the coating process at the ovens, and then other of it goes to the export. But it is truck.
Truck, okay. Thanks, Craig. Same person asks, is there a risk of connectivity within the two dam walls? Is the 300, well, it's a question about whether or not the setbacks are going to protect the dam walls. There's certainly some concerns that have been presented to the department, and I'm sure to the IPC, about the risk of cracking of dam walls. I can't remember the detail of that. Has anyone else?
I've read some comments in relation to this. There's some opposition because of potential impacts on dam walls. It wasn't written as in terms of cracking. It was talking about a certain amount of subsidence affecting the dam walls. But, you know, that can have, I presume, damaging effects or lead to cracking or something else. So it is somewhere in the Water New South Wales documents, I believe.
Okay, great. Thanks, Deirdre. Now, Craig's reminded me there are a couple of people with their hands raised in the chat box. If you could, at this point, what would be great is if you're happy just to type a question into the Q&A box, if you can, or the chat box, if and hopefully we can pick that up and answer that question for you. Suzanne's
While it's happening.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, you're on it. That's the one, Nick.
Great, thanks, Craig. Suzanne's also asked, is there any subsidy being provided by state or federal government for this extension? I would say yes, there are, if it were to go ahead. I haven't got to the detail of that yet, but certainly one subsidy is that if no conditions are imposed for new coal mines like this one, which would be very gassy, produce lots of emissions, if no condition of consent is opposed requiring the company to offset that, then effectively taxpayers who contribute to the federal government's emissions reduction fund are paying for those emissions to be removed from the atmosphere. And that's doubly so for many coal mining companies that pay zero tax and many more who pay very little tax. So that's just one subsidy. Of course, another subsidy could be the Water New South Wales and the scientific committee are saying, look, we really don't know how much drinking water will be lost, and there is the possibility that could continue in perpetuity. Well, drinking water is worth a lot of money. The department has asked South32 to value it at between $2,300 and $3,100 per megalitre. And bear in mind that in 2032-ish, this project is going to be losing about 26 megalitres a day, 26 million litres a day. So that's, $60,000 to $80,000 worth of water every day that's disappearing. So if more is lost, or if it's lost in perpetuity, then effectively the public pays for that. That's a subsidy to make this project more profitable if South32 aren't required to cover that cost. So there's two subsidies in my view. Does anyone else have a view on that issue?
Yes, there's extra subsidies. There's if there's offsetting or support through the Coal Innovation Fund. There's also the community paying for the loss of ecosystems. There's a whole lot of unaccounted costs in the whole proposal, which are effectively subsidies by the community. Can I interrupt here, Nick, because I said I'd butt in at 8 o'clock and put this stuff up on the screen. It's now 8 o'clock, everyone. We're going to keep talking if people have more questions, but just want to emphasize again I hope everyone can see the screen. The public hearing registration's due by the 23rd of November. Public hearing dates are the 2nd, 3rd and 4th of December, and written submissions due by the 15th of December. If you're clocking off now, you're welcome to stay online, but if you're clocking off now, I'm going to put together various PDFs with notes attached from all of us and some others and send them through, and then you can look through them. Also links to videos. And I think that was all the things I had to say organisationally, wasn't it, everyone?
Yeah, that's great.
I want to just address another question which someone asked, and that is about, I haven't got in this screen, I don't know if you can see this question. Tony Kennedy asked, the question above asks about lost water, both surface and groundwater. What about the total amount of water lost, including by contamination? And I think this is a really important question because water is critical to this scenario, and there's a whole program of offsets, and I am just going to pull them up and pull up the slide and show you where sorry, I'm having difficulty just doing too many things at once. There is a program of offsets where they supposedly offset, sorry, which slide? This slide here. So can you see this table, everyone?
No, I don't think you've shared your screen.
Okay, so I need to share my screen again, sorry. This share screen, so.
Okay, yes, we can see it now.
Yeah, so this table here is what was proposed. Water New South Wales complained, Water New South Wales complained about water losses. So the water goes into the mine and then it comes out of the mine. The South 32 proposed a net gain of water to the water catchment, and they did it in a completely, I think, misleading and not very honest way. What they propose is to get the water that comes out of the mine, which is contaminated with heavy metals and salts and things like that. And then what they're going to do is they say that they're going to either direct offset or indirect offset. And on this table here, you can see this column here is the direct offsets. And on this column here, it's indirect offsets. And if they are going to direct offset, what they're going to do is build for $34 million a water treatment plant. And then they are going to pump. They'd have to get approvals for pipelines. They're going to pump it down to industrial users such as BlueScope or Port Kembla Coal Terminal or whoever, okay? And then at the end of the operating life, they would pay, they'd gift the facility to the New South Wales government, but with no operating costs or support or maintenance things attached. Alternatively, they're proposing a direct offset. Now, I might say that there's no guarantee any industry is wanting necessarily to take this money, but this is how they're claiming that there is a net gain to the catchment, because all the water that drains into the mine, they're proposing to treat if they can get industrial users and if they can get lots of ifs and buts. Alternatively, what they're proposing is that, well, if that doesn't work out, what they will do is they will pay an annual contribution of money to the New South Wales government, which is worth $2,300 per megalitre. And the arbitrary number of $34 million to the New South Wales government at the end of the life of the mine. And that $34 million is the cost of the water treatment plant, that for which is, they say, their preferred option, but they don't end up making. So just because arbitrarily that would be what they estimate cost them is the cost of the water treatment plant, they'll give that to the New South Wales government at the end to treat the mine water. But if it hasn't worked during the course of the mine operation, why would it be suddenly suitable and only cost that amount in 28 years' time? It's much more likely to cost a whole lot more. And if it wasn't suitable up front, why is it going to be suitable at the end of the time? Most likely, what would happen is the government would have to build a wastewater treatment plant, treat the water, and possibly treat it to a much higher standard, or treat it and pump it back into the catchment itself. It is all so woolly. The other thing you can see, if you look here, there's columns of or, and then there's an and. To compensate Water New South Wales, rather than this money that they're giving the New South Wales government is different from what they're giving Water New South Wales. They've got a compensation for losses of water, surface water specifically, not groundwater, but surface water to New South Wales. But none of this accounts for the groundwater. So this is based on estimated or predicted surface water losses. And you've got another whole can of worms as to who estimates it, how is that actually validated, and the cost to the consumer and to the government in doing all of the legwork around that. So, yeah, I suppose my point with this slide is to point out that they're claiming a net gain to the water catchment when first of all, they're not compensating for groundwater anywhere in the system, not even making any pretense of it. And there's a whole lot of holes and issues in this proposal here, which is to deal with offsetting the surface water. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Deirdre. All right. Does anyone, I must confess, I'm starting to experience low blood sugars and feeling it's time for dinner. Does any of my fellow panelists care to answer any final questions? Otherwise, we'll do our best to answer your questions in the follow-up email in the coming day or two.
Yeah, probably just a quick correction from Phil highlighted the road transport. So the road transport to the facility, it's rail transport. Thanks, Phil.
Great, no worries. Thank you, Craig. All right, yeah, and then there's some more good material there in the chat box. Dr. Rada, did you have anything more you wanted to add? No. Craig, what about you, sir? Deirdre?
No, I'm fine. Well, I haven't read through all the questions, so I think we'll try, if there's any really outstanding questions, I'll try and put answers to them if we can find them in the, when we send out the email in a few days' time.
Great. All right. Well, look, thank you for sticking with us. You 30 people still online. Really appreciate you guys joining us and your interest in this issue. It's a really important issue. Damage to the catchment in perpetuity versus, you know, another 28 years of longwall mining at Dendrobium. So thank you very much for joining us and giving us your time. And we hope that was useful for you. And we'd love it if you register to speak to the IPC. Remember, the deadline for that is 5 p.m. this coming Monday. The public hearing then is the 2nd to the 4th of December, and you've got until about mid-December to get a written submission in on this issue. Thank you to Protect Our Water Alliance for all the awesome work you guys have done as an alliance, generating a really great submission guide. If you haven't seen that, do have a look at POWA's website. There is some great material there that will help you make a written submission. And that's about it. Over and out from me, Nick from Lock the Gate Alliance. Thank you to my fellow hosts, and thank you to all of you guys who joined us.
Thanks heaps, Nick. Thank you.
Good night.
Night.